Okay, thanks for including our paper in this nice conference. This paper is various risk premiums in emerging markets. It's joint with Lai, Xiaoyan, and Hao. So what is various risk premium, or for short, VRP? It is defined as the difference between implied variance from option prices and the expectation of the realized variance from market index returns. We call the difference as the VRP. Since the proposition of the VRP, it is growing larger and larger in the asset pricing literature. In these papers, they interpret the VRP as a proxy for economic uncertainty risk. So in the empirical work, the VRP could predict stock market returns in the US and in the developed markets. And it could also predict the currency returns to solve the forward premium puzzle. And it could predict the other asset risk premiums. As we see, VRP is very important in the US and in developed markets. So how is VRP in emerging markets? Here is our official motivation. We know that emerging markets are becoming more and more important in globalization. Here, see the plot for the market capitalization. The blue line represents the market capitalization of the emerging economies. We see there is an upward trend in recent years. Yeah? And however, we also know that emerging markets have their own unique risk that is different from developed markets. For example, they have a higher volatility risk and they have more positive skewness. It indicates that the study in developed markets can't be copied to the study in emerging markets directly. So in our paper, we will focus on 9 emerging markets. They are Brazil, China, India, Korea, Mexico, Poland, Russia, South Africa, and Taiwan. We have their market index, and we also collect their option implied volatility index for these markets, and we have their starting dates for these 2 indices. Here, from the last row, these are the starting dates for the option implied volatility index. We see they have short samples for the emerging markets. For example, China has the shortest sample, which started in 2015. And Korea is the earliest market, which started in 2003. So we see that if we want to study in emerging markets, we have a challenge that is the shortest of the option implied volatility index data. Now, what we do in our paper, we have 2 main contributions. We are the first to construct the long sample VRPs for the 9 emerging markets because the option data are very short, and we apply the sample extension methodology as in Lin and Vulture and extend the sample back to 2000. This makes the study in emerging markets feasible. Second, our second contribution is we document the predictive power of the aggregate VRPs from emerging markets. We call it EM-VRP, and we compare it with the DM-VRP. And we have the novel findings. The EM-VRP can predict the stock market returns, currency returns, and capital inflows. More importantly, we find the EM-VRP is different from the DM-VRP. The EM-VRP is more important for short horizon. EM-VRP is more important for longer horizons after 3 months, while the DM-VRP is more important for short horizons up to 3 months. Here is the data in our paper. The sample period is from January 2000 until the October 2017, and we focus on 9 emerging markets. with the available option implied volatility index. And in order to compare our result with the developed markets, we collect 11 developed markets data. And the data are from different sources. Here is the methodology in the paper. The first, we construct the VRPs. For each country, we have its market index returns, and we also have its option implied volatility index, and we construct the country-level VRP. It is the difference between implied variance and the expectation of the realized variance. The realized variance is the sum of the daily squared returns over 1 month. As of now, we have the country-level VRP. We aggregate these VRPs as a proxy for global risk or global uncertainty or systematic risk. So the global VRP is defined as the value-weighted average of the country-level VRPs across 9 emerging markets and 11 developed markets. And the EM-VRP is the value-weighted average of the country-level VRPs only in emerging markets. And the DM-VRP is defined in a similar fashion. Here is our methodology to extend the long sample implied variance. We have 3 sets of variables, realized variance, and the predictors Z. They are observed in the long sample period, and the sample length is capital T. And we have the implied variance, which is very short, and the sample length is the lambda T here. As we do the regressions of the realized variance on the predictors Z in the long sample period. And we have the coefficient theta 1t and its moment. And secondly, in the short sample period, we do the same regression and we obtain the theta 1 lambda t and its moment. And thirdly, we do the regressions on the implied variance on the predictors, and we obtain the parameter theta 2 lambda t. If we want to have the long sample implied variance, we need theta 2t. But the theta 2t can't be obtained directly from the regression, so it is adjusted based on a transition matrix B21. For our predictors, they are from the financial market, and some are from the macro variables. And these variables are well documented in the literature to be able to predict the variance or VRP. Here is the estimation result for China. And from the last row, we see the R-squares are higher in China's market for the estimation. And here is the plot of the VRP and the variance. Here, in 2008, there was a global financial crisis, and we see huge spikes during this period for VRP and variance. And similarly, in 2013, there was a local turbulence in China, and we see huge spikes in the VRP and in the variance. And here is the plot for India's VRP and India's variance. And similarly, we see huge spikes during the 2008 financial crisis. And we have the country-level VRPs for each market, and we aggregate and we obtain the global VRP. Here, this is the 2002 internet bubble crisis. We see some small spikes, and the 2008 huge spikes in 2008 financial crisis period. After that, it is the European debt financial crisis. And here is the patterns for EM-VRP and the DM-VRPs. The EM-VRPs, we see these 2 patterns are very different. Here, this is the 2008 internet bubble bursted, and we see spikes in DM-VRP, but no for EM-VRP. For the 2008 financial crisis, we see negative spikes for the DM-VRP, but positive spikes for EM-VRP. And after that, this is the European debt crisis. We see some small spikes in DM-VRP, but no spikes in the EMVRP. And here, this is a bit like China's turbulence. And here, this is the summary statistics on the VRP, on the EMVRP. And generally, the average of the country-level VRPs are positive, except for Brazil and China. And here, for the correlation between the country-level VRPs with the aggregate EMVRPs, the correlations are all positive and high, except for Brazil. And it indicates that there is a commonality among VRPs in emerging markets. Here, for the correlation between the EMVRP and the DMVRP, their correlation is low. It's only 0.31. It means these two VRPs contain different risks. As for the correlation between DMVRP and the global VRP, their correlation is 0.97. This is very high. It means the global VRP is mainly dominated by the DMVRP, the VRPs from developed markets. And here, this is the summary statistics on the developed markets, and the correlation between the country-level VRPs and the aggregate DMVRPs are very high, except for Japan here. It means there is a commonality among the VRPs in developed markets. Now here we have different, We have different VRPs, and what we do next, we predict the stock market returns. On the left-hand side, it is cumulative stock returns. And on the right-hand side, we have different VRPs, and we control the country fixed effect. Here is the result. We compare the country-level VRP and the global VRP. Here, the coefficients on country-level VRPs are positive but significant after 3 months, and the R-square is very low. For the global VRP, we see the coefficients are positive and significant except month 18, and the R-square is much higher than the country-level VRPs. It means global risk is more important than the country-level risk in this result. Here we compare the predictive power for EMVRP and the DMVRP. Here we see the coefficients on EMVRPs are positive and significant for all horizons. And the coefficients on DMVRP are positive and significant in the first 6 months. And we compare these two R-squares. The R-squares for DMVRP is much higher than the squares of the EMVRP in the first 3 months. It means DMVRP is more important in the short horizon. And we put these two VRPs in one panel regression. We see the coefficients on EMVRP are significant after 3 months, and the coefficients on DMVRPs are significant in the first month. It also shows that EMVRP and DMVRP, they are different, and the DMVRP is more important in the short horizons. And here we give the potential explanation for the difference in EMVRP and the DMVRP. First is the Boleslav and Joe. They show the VRP can be driven by 2 volatility factors, cash flow volatility and discount rate volatility in the consumption-based asset pricing model. So cash flow volatility is more persistent, and it predicts returns in longer horizons, while the discount rate volatility is more reverting, and it predicts returns in short horizons. In our empirical results, we first see the AR1 coefficient of the DMVRP. It's only 0.36. It's for the AR1 coefficient on EMVRP, it is 0.46. So the EMVRP is more persistent than the DMVRP. And we use the US 3-month Treasury bill rate volatility as a proxy for discount rate volatility. And we saw the correlation between the EMVRP and the discount rate volatility is only 0.09. And the correlation between DMVRP and the discount rate volatility is 0.24. And for the cash flow volatility, we use the GDP growth rate volatility as a proxy for cash flow volatility. And the correlation between the EMVRP and the cash flow volatility is 0.33. And for DMVRP, it is 0.21. here we conclude that EMVRP is more correlated with the cash flow volatility, and the DMVRP is more correlated with the discount rate volatility. And we also have some similar findings for currency returns prediction and capital inflows prediction. And we also do a serious robustness test within our results, and our results are robust. And here we give you a quick conclusion of the paper. We first use the sample extension methodology of Lee and Virtual, and we extend the sample back to 2000, and this makes the study in emerging markets feasible. And we document the predictive power of the EMVRP, and we find the EMVRP and the DMVRP contain different risks. The DMVRP is more important in short horizons, while the EMVRP is more important in longer horizons. So that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. So I would like to thank for the opportunity to be the discussant for this paper. I did learn a lot about the potential for emerging VRP in explaining returns, especially in a different horizon than we know that the developed market VRP works. So I think the paper is really good. I'm only going to comment on a couple of ways in which they can enlighten us as to why this could be happening. And so just to begin with, let me spend some time on what this VRP is. So I should have supposed to put a model in here. I think I forgot to put that. So Bolerslave, Towson, and Joe, they come up with this stylized model, which has recursive utility in it. And there is consumption growth. And the volatility of consumption growth is experiencing shocks. So there are shocks to both volatility of consumption and volatility of consumption. And this is not an observed variable, so we have to figure out how this explains returns. According to the model, the shock to volatility and volatility of volatility, they get a risk premium. So there is a part of risk premium which can be attributed to these two shocks. Simply, we can think of them as shocks to volatility for the moment. And they also show that if they compute this variance risk premium measure, which is the difference between risk neutral expectation of return variance and physical expectation of return variance, the state variable which affects the volatility shocks is captured by this. Okay, that's a theoretical idea. This variance risk premium captures the risk because of shocks to consumption growth volatility. And empirically, a lot of papers tested whether this is working. And in empirical test, how we compute variance risk premium is we compute implied variance using options prices, a model-free computation of option prices. And realized variance is also mostly people use model-free. You just compute the sum of squared returns using intraday data or daily data. And that's how they compute variance risk premium in empirical studies. And prior studies have shown robust results that variance risk premium does predict stock returns. And initially, they did studies in US market because implied volatility was available for a longer period of time. And mostly, we find that the predictability is in the short-term horizon. Mostly, as Fang pointed out, mostly in the monthly to a quarterly horizon. And so it appears that variance risk premium captures short-term shocks to consumption growth volatility. And Bolerslave et al. 2014 tried to see whether is this a kind of data mining issue, is variance risk premium, is it capturing risk premium in other markets as well? And they found significant results. And now, before I read this paper, variance risk premium does capture, even in developed markets, the risk premium that is attributed to growth to volatility shocks, but in the short-term horizon. So now I'll go to the contribution of this paper quickly. And as Fang pointed out, they do a lot of good work. Implied volatility data, the options data in most emerging markets were introduced recently. So they're not long enough to construct a good series. So they use this Lynch and Wachter sample extension data. Their result holds irrespective of both. So I thought this is a good way of doing it. And they also compute a global variance risk premium, developed variance risk premium, and emerging variance risk premium. And this is the new measure that they arrive at. And I would, the best part of the results, in my opinion, was these three things. First, global VRP predicts individual country returns. So there is a commonality in a risk premium, which is there is a commonality in consumption growth shocks. There is kind of a term structure kind of things with respect to variance risk premium, because developed variance risk premium predicts shorter horizon returns, whereas emerging markets predicts medium horizon returns or a little bit longer horizon returns. So couple of quick technical points which Josh said this time of the conference people are supposed to give because nobody gave it. This paper, they generally run panel regressions, and with panel regressions, there is a cross-sectional correlations when we are using panel regression of returns. And I don't think the results are going to change so much, but I still think the appropriate measure of correcting for standard errors in panel regressions is clustering for cross-sectional correlation, and that's one thing. And the second thing is, because the primary contribution is emerging markets variance risk premium, and it captures return predictability in the medium-term horizon, you have to also ensure that it captures more than dividend yield, default risk premium, which also captures returns, expected returns in similar horizons. But more importantly, I think I don't think this is going to affect the results much. It's just me being picky. Yeah, what is the bigger story? So for me, what I'm wondering is, what is the bigger story of this? So I was thinking this. Let's think at the global consumption growth. So let's construct the return series of global returns and global consumption growth. So I'm taking the same model, Boller-Slave et al., where there are shocks to volatility of consumption growth. So what I'm thinking is it possible that the global consumption growth are exposed to short-term consumption growth risks and long-term consumption growth risk? And so instead of one shocks, maybe there are two shocks, and there is nothing that says shocks lasting different duration should not hold. And I was thinking, is it possible that the emerging market VRP is capturing longer-lived shocks to global consumption growth? And I was trying to think of some channels. I'm not an expert in those kind of channels. So some of the channels I thought was, maybe we are exposed to emerging consumption. Now the world is more connected, and the relationship between global consumption and emerging markets could come in the form of trade links, capital flows, a little bit of global risk appetite. And maybe these things ensure that emerging markets consumption growth is more exposed to longer term shocks in consumption growth risk. And that would imply that developed markets are not that exposed. So I thought maybe some of it could be because of government coming in, and some essentially institutions which help better consumption smoothing in developed markets when compared to emerging markets. So this is, I think if you find something similar, and if you can show that there are two different types of shocks and present a theory that emerging markets are more exposed to longer term shocks, and this variance risk premium measure is precisely capturing it. I think it will be more powerful. So just to conclude, I think it's a great paper, and the biggest contribution is emerging market VRP adds incrementally explains returns across the world, mostly in the medium-term horizon. And I am speculating that it could be because it captures long-term shocks to consumption growth of the whole world. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a little time for discussion. Any other? Yes, Larry?
So I have two comments. The first one's amusing. They're about both papers. So the first one is that the inquiring mind has to wonder when two authors discuss each other's paper whether there was a potential for collusion. Now, much more seriously, both papers examine asset pricing implications associated with variables that themselves may be priced or perhaps the variation is priced. And so I just wanted to make a quick observation about the associated dynamics. So suppose you have a variable that you believe is priced, and then the value of that variable changes. So say we think that the pricing is positive, that the higher values lead to higher expected returns on average unconditionally. Okay? When that variable changes, say it increases, then what has to happen is that returns have to drop so that they can produce the higher expected returns, and vice versa. So if that's the case, then you get some interesting dynamics, and those, of course, would be conditional dynamics. So in both papers, we have situations where we're wondering whether the liquidity is priced or variation liquidity is priced. The second paper, we're wondering whether volatility is priced, and we're also looking at the dynamics of volatility, which is essentially variation in volatility. And so we have this situation where there's a potential for some fairly interesting dynamics that, if they could be traced through, might produce substantially stronger results in both papers. The problem is that in both cases, the variable, liquidity or volatility, is highly mean reverting. And so long-term expectations likely are going to be fairly constant, not likely to change very much. And so perhaps the gains from pursuing this line might not be as great as we otherwise might think. But still, I think it's useful to remember that when we do asset pricing studies, we're usually focused on the unconditional. But where we have a fair amount of data about how things change, we have the potential to actually work through the conditional implications and potentially more interesting.
Yes, Nathan?
So the inclusion of South Korea and Taiwan, to a less extent, the Taiwan as an emerging market, on the emerging market. So I know in the earlier sample in 2000, I definitely agree with like South Korea is emerging market. But in the later sample, 2013 or 15, it could be considered more in between. So I'm a little worried that do you consider South Korea today as an emerging market? Based on the IMF definition, South Korea and Taiwan are definitely out of the emerging market. But FTSE sometimes including Taiwan as emerging market. So it's up to you. So one thing you could do, you can look at the autocorrelation between the GDP growth and interest rate changes to see where they belong to the short-term guy or the long-term guy. So that will give you a little. So at least you can do like excluding one or two of this and to see whether that results. So just a curiosity. Thanks.
Okay, Frank, could you get back to all of us with some interesting responses?
Yes, thanks for all the comments. I would like to respond to Sarah's comments about the career, whether it is a developed market or emerging market. My category about the emerging market and developed market is based on MSCI, the categorization. Yeah, so maybe we can try to use the IMF or something like that. I think
there's a 5 major
yeah.
categorizer. One is FTSE, MSCI, IMF,
Yeah.
what more? So they categorize which country belonging to this. So you can see there's a table on it. Actually, you can Google it. There's a table. You can see all the countries get the ticks. So China get all 5 ticks. South Korea got like 2, and like Taiwan sometimes gets over time it's dropping the ticks. So the more ticks you get, you are emerging market. So Indian get 5 ticks like all the way.
Oh, so we use a very recent category from MSCI, but I think Korea has a not so big market capitalization in the emerging markets, so I don't think it could affect our results more. I'd like to thanks for Barry's good comments about the panel regressions with double clustering. I think I will. After that, I think I will do the double clustering with the time and country, and I think our result may not change yet about this. And for the potential explanation between the EMVRP and the DMVRP, I think this is a very good point, and we are also working on a model to define the emerging market consumption growth and the developed market consumption growth, and we are trying to introduce the market integration in the consumption growth. So this is a very good point, and also thanks for Larry's comments about our time series of the VRP. It is mean reverting, yeah, and in asset pricing, like I think. For volatility, we compare the second moment of the return with its the first moment. I think volatility is more persisting than return. So this is the only way we can do it. Thanks for the comment.
Now, regarding the last point, I think it's a very important point,
Yeah.
and so which you already highlighted. So this is your point is very clear when we are trying to predict returns using dividend yield, because that dividend yield is persistent, and there is a component of expected return which is very persistent, and conditional dynamics typically works how it goes. But as you already highlighted, because of faster mean reverting, VRP only captures risk premium in very short-term horizon. But of course, the emerging VRP, they have to check how it goes. And therefore, it is not very persistent. And so I'm not sure whether the conditional dynamics here, as you anticipated, is going to be as strong as we find in dividend yields. And one more comment on Korea. So this is a trade-off, right? If you include Korea in developed market, then somebody is going to accuse you of look-ahead bias. So, or you do it both ways.
Or you view it as a natural experiment where a country shifted from EM to DM, and did the correlations change as your theory predicts?
Yeah, I like that.